a lot of the folks who've been using Periscope for years have migrated, and you can find a link to it, link to the platform on my profile page here on Periscope. Anyways, today I'd like to chat about a few discoveries that I came across over the past few days. Here we go. So the first was a study that was published in the journal Cancer Cell. Let's see, where are we? There we go. And bingo. Lovely. Hey, from Edinburgh. Oh no, Periscope connection unavailable again. Jeez. Please toggle Periscope on and off. Sorry, everybody. That is so strange. Starting. Oh well. Let's see, maybe we can try it again. Boom. Let's see. Otherwise, no big deal. Good to see you, Helen. Okay, so this was a study that was published in Cancer Cell, which is a very prestigious scientific journal, and they explored one of the more puzzling symptoms of COVID-19, which I've discussed a few times in the past, and these are the neurological symptoms that are experienced by people who end up being infected with SARS coronavirus 2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19. And so this study has a fair bit of jargon in it, and it's a little bit complicated, but just stick with me, and I promise we'll get through it together. It'll make sense. Hey, what's up, Mark? Good to see you, man. And hey, Isa, good to see you. So we're starting with a paper that focuses on like the cognitive fog that people who come down with COVID-19 can experience. Not always, but more frequently than I think most of us might expect. So over the past year or so, it's become clear that quite a few people who end up with COVID-19 confront neurological symptoms, right? And we're talking about like a pretty wide range. They say anywhere between 7% and 69%, which is basically akin to saying like it could be a tiny minority of patients who experience neurological symptoms, or it could be the majority. So obviously, we're not entirely sure how common these symptoms are. But it's not particularly surprising that this would be, the current state of affairs. After all, a lot of countries have basically like oscillated between having hospitals that are essentially like overwhelmed by the numbers of people ending up in the hospital with the virus and, being fairly calm. Like that's how it's been in Philly basically the whole time. And so, as a result, I imagine it's pretty difficult for there to be like a consistent collection of like standardized characterizations of neurological symptoms, right? If like, at some points, physicians are only seeing like a handful of COVID-19 patients. And then at other times, they're just like hanging on by the skin of their teeth and just focused on like keeping as many of them alive as they possibly can. They're not necessarily like, scrutinizing every aspect of their experience. Yes. Oh, weird. Yeah, that's too bad. Understood. Oh, well, it's live on Twitter. So not quite as many people there, but oh, well, it'll be up here. Regardless, at this point, it's pretty uncontroversial to acknowledge that, a meaningful proportion of people who come down with COVID-19 develop symptoms. And these symptoms would usually be considered to be neurological. And I've actually talked about examples of this in the past, like over the past several months. And you can find some of those stories on my YouTube page, youtube.com/anthropoid, and just like search for COVID-19 or something. But anyway, so in this study, which came from a group that spread across a few different departments at the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York City, which is one of the premier biomedical institutions in the world, certainly in the country. And there's a reason that they were all departments of cancer. This group was focused on individuals with cancer who came down with COVID-19. So there are both disadvantages as well as advantages to what we can learn from this paper as a result. So, of course, the primary disadvantage is that most people are fortunate enough to not be confronting cancer, right? And to be clear, like the group of 18 patients with whom they worked had a variety of different types of cancers, right? So nearly half the group were immunocompromised. And quite a few had some kind of comorbidity, things like hypertension, smoking in the past, hyperlipidemia, which is basically just like elevated levels of fat or cholesterol or triglycerides in the blood, or diabetes, these types of comorbidities. But let's talk about comorbidities for just 1 second. So I see and hear quite a few people out there saying that, we're all overestimating the threats that COVID-19 poses to most of us. After all, it's the people who are older, who have some kind of pre-existing condition, who tend to be at the greatest risk, right? And that's true. However, first of all, the notion that this is like presented as an argument for why we shouldn't consider COVID-19 to be as like a significant concern strikes me as being pretty obviously horrible. Like if you take a second to think about it, like even if it were true that essentially like only the people who need to worry about this are, you know, who need to worry about this virus, or people who are already confronting some kind of medical malady, you know, consigning them to an early fatality just because like other people aren't at as high of a risk is like ethically pretty repugnant. Like, and I understand the argument they're making, right? There is a cost to us all, you know, protecting the interests of folks in that position. But I reject the notion that we ought to simply just accept a wave of fatalities, you know, across individuals who otherwise like enjoy many years of life, whose families would enjoy their years of their lives, you know, benefit from their wisdom, their insights, you know, their stories, their life stories, their humor and their intelligence. Like I just reject that we ought to just accept mass losses among some of the dearest people in our lives simply because the rest of us can't get our acts together, right? And that said, like, I suspect the people who make this argument are actually unfamiliar with just how widespread chronic disease is in the United States. So just to give you an example here. So they were immunocompromised. Yeah, so a proportion of the folks in this study were immunocompromised, yeah. But you know, and chronic diseases as well, right? But so I think people underestimate just how widespread chronic disease is in the United States. And it's not like the United States is like that unique when it comes to these types of statistics. So here's some data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC here in the US. And so they find that 6 in 10 adults in the United States have a chronic disease of some kind, and 4 in 10 have 2 or more. So that's 60% with at least one chronic disease, 40% with more than one. Okay. And so, you know, they show some of the most common causes, right? Heart disease, cancer, chronic lung diseases, stroke, Alzheimer's, diabetes, kidney disease, right? The usual suspects, right? And those are just the highlights, right? You know, there are other chronic diseases, of course. And they also show, you know, some of the leading lifestyle factors that can cause chronic disease, you know, smoking, obviously always up there, poor nutrition, of course, physical inactivity, you know, not exercising or getting much exercise, excessive drinking, right? We all know that these things can predispose to chronic disease. But you might just say, okay, well then just stop smoking, eat better, exercise, and stop drinking, right? And then problem solved. And I mean, that's fair. Like those things matter. People should do those things. But I think it's worth acknowledging that we live in this world at this moment. These are the public health circumstances we're confronting today, right? Yes, we should all live healthier lives. Of course, no one in biomedical science would suggest otherwise, but like just harping on and on about how we all need to be emphasizing better diet and exercise rather than, you know, taking some, you know, mitigation measures just to mitigate the spread of COVID-19, you know, strikes me as kind of like a silly thing on which to focus, just harping on that when we have an imminent threat to the survival of over 60% of the population. Okay. All right. Off my soapbox. So lung cancer. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Colon cancer. Those who do not smoke are also, lung cancer is becoming more and more common among people who don't smoke. It's an odd statistic that's been observed now that, the numbers of cases of people who end up having lung disease who've never, or lung cancer who've never smoked is increasing. And we don't actually know exactly why that is. It's an interesting question. But anyways, all right, off my soapbox. So back to this study. Thank you, CDC. All right. So the people in this study exhibited like a handful of different neurological symptoms, right? So most of them experienced prolonged delirium, various areas of inflammation in the brain, and we'll talk about some of the imaging they did to determine that. Headaches and ischemic infarcts are basically strokes, right? Or signs of strokes. So, which was associated with COVID-19, to be clear. So they provide some neuroimaging of the patients, but this one, oh shoot, do I have it? Yeah, here we go. Sorry about that. I thought I already uploaded it. But no problem. 2 seconds, bing, bang, boom, and Bob's your uncle. All right. So this I think is you know, one of the images that they provide that I think proves their point the best. So this was a 61-year-old man, right? So not particularly old, who had a form of lung cancer, who came down with COVID-19. And so one of the advantages, I mentioned that there are disadvantages and advantages to this paper, right? One of the advantages to a study like this is that because these folks were patients before COVID-19 struck, they had imaging data of the patients before they came down with COVID-19. So they knew at a pretty granular level, right, what their baseline physiology was in the brain. Okay, so you can see what his brain looked like 2 months before he tested positive for COVID-19. Great, super useful. And then basically what they're showing as you go across the image, basically what they're showing is that as he catches COVID-19 and then recovers from it, there are some visible anatomical changes in the brain, okay? And which they're suggesting is sort of like perhaps one of the fundamental reasons or one of the main thing that underlies some of the like negative neurological ramifications of COVID-19. And what I think is perhaps a little bit more interesting or useful is that they tended to find inflammatory molecules in the cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF. And so the CSF is basically like salt water that bathes the brain basically and circulates through the spinal cord and through the ventricles, these like caverns throughout the brain. Very important fluid. It carries nutrients to and away, and waste byproducts away from the brain. It does a bunch of things. Okay, so they found these inflammatory molecules in the CSF, in cerebral spinal fluid. Inflammatory molecules are molecules that are associated with like certain reactions of the immune system that are involved in how our bodies respond to pathogens in general, generally viral pathogens, but like others as well. Bacteria, for example. So I've talked about a few studies in the past that have shown various ways by which SARS coronavirus 2, the virus that causes COVID-19, can actually directly infect neurons and glial cells, which are the two primary types of brain cells. Several studies have shown that it's at least capable of infecting neurons and glial cells. But whether or not the virus itself actually like enters the brain in humans still remains to be seen. Like whether it can actually get past the blood-brain barrier. There are good reasons to suspect that it might be capable of doing so, but we're not quite there yet. But what this study suggests is that is probably what was likely like the most widely held suspicion in biomedical science, that all of these neurological symptoms are not due to the virus itself directly, that causing these neurological reactions, like not directly because it's infecting neurons and infecting glial cells, things like that. It's not directly interacting with neurons, or at least, that's not the only way by which people develop these neurological symptoms. What they're suggesting is that it's the escalation of inflammatory molecules from the immune system, from your own immune system, in response to the presence of the virus, that's likely causing quite a bit of these neurological reactions. All right, we can remove this. Oh, thank you for the super hearts, Asha. Good to see you. Hey, Lucia. From Santo Domingo. Oh, very cool. Wow, you guys are all over the place. One of my best friends growing up was from Santo Domingo. I assume you're in the Dominican Republic because that's the Santo Domingo he's from. Anyway, so the reason this team was sort of like optimally positioned to detect this effect of inflammatory molecules in COVID-19 patients is another advantage of this kind of a paper, is because a lot of the same types of molecules are elevated in patients who are being treated for various kinds of cancer. Right. So, people oftentimes, and I've heard it many, many times over the years, people bring up a sort of like brain fog or confusion that cancer patients can experience, even when their cancer is like nowhere near their brain. Right. And, we know that at least in many cases, that whole syndrome is associated, that whole like brain fog associated with cancer therapy is associated with the elevation of these inflammatory molecules. And so this team was used to seeing the usual suspects, of these inflammatory molecules in cancer patients. And what they found was that a very similar pattern was occurring in people who came down with COVID-19. Okay, the inflammatory molecules that can be elevated in cancer patients were slightly different from the ones they found in COVID-19 patients, but there was some overlap. So in other words, there was a similar but not identical immune system response for it's for the cancer patients that they manage that have this kind of response. They're typically treated with anti-inflammatory steroids to manage the reaction, right? To manage that inflammation. This study suggests that it might be possible that a similar treatment might mitigate the severity of these kinds of neurological responses to COVID-19. And after all, we know that quite a few COVID-19 patients do end up being treated with steroids, just to manage the non-neurological symptoms of the condition. And so it may be the case that we'd be seeing quite a bit more, examples of these neurological symptoms if fewer COVID-19 patients ended up receiving those anti-inflammatory steroids. You probably remember hearing so much about dexamethasone several months ago, when like everybody was pretty much like scrambling to find a medication, any kind of medication that would reduce the fatalities derived from COVID-19. You might remember dexamethasone. That's what dexamethasone is. It's an anti-inflammatory steroid. So that's what we get. That's what we get from this paper. We have a better sense of how it is the strange neurological symptoms, we've been seeing in at least some people who develop COVID-19 may come about, and a possible avenue to treat them more rapidly and more effectively. So very cool. Thank you very much, Isa. Yeah, well, I grew up in Miami, Lucia, so quite a few people from DR, but a really good one, a really good person from DR was my best friend. Anyways, Andres Guzman. All right, next study. Let's see. So this is going to be just a quick one. This one focuses on the relationships between diet, aging, and cognitive function. So I believe I have it right here. Here we go. So this is what's called a cross-sectional study of people who are 79 years old. So a cross-sectional study, don't worry about that terminology. It just basically means it's when scientists or researchers ask a question about a population. What's the effect of diet? What's the effect of exercise on, muscle strength or on your ability to remember words, right? And then, just collect data at a specific point in time. Like we're collecting data over this week. And so we have a cross-section of this population, right? And so, and they just collect data at that specific point in time. So this is as opposed to like a longitudinal study, which is where researchers ask, a question about a population, but then follow that population over an extended period of time. And so those are harder to conduct for obvious reasons, right? But basically, this is what they found. So people in their study who tended to adhere to a Mediterranean diet tended to exhibit better cognitive function. Okay, and this was irrespective. They controlled for issues like childhood IQ, smoking, physical activity, exercise, and so on, right? These types of lifestyle factors. And so what makes this study a little bit extra interesting, hey, from Copenhagen, hello, from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in the United States. So what made this study a little bit more interesting was that they took some MRIs from some of the patients. And so just as a reminder, in case you're unfamiliar, oh, I thought I already uploaded it. No problem. Bing, bang, boom. Dunzo. Ready to roll. All right. So this is what an MRI looks like. You've probably seen images like this. It basically just gives you like a way to take pictures of the brain, basically like in slices or it can be in slices so you can get a sense of like a person's neuroanatomy. You can do MRIs for more than just the brain, but you can do it for the brain as well. And it you detect things like the presence of tumors or, if somebody has had a stroke or an aneurysm, things like that, right? But it can also give you a sense of like the sizes of the various brain regions, as well as the differences in how much gray matter or white matter a person has in any given region, the ratio of gray to white matter. And so just as a reminder, gray matter is where actual neurons, right? Gray matter is like where the actual neuronal cell bodies, the somata, as we call it in the biz, like when you look at a neuron, the actual cell itself, not all the fun little tentacles that it can have, that's gray matter, right? The actual neurons. And then white matter is the connectivity between neurons. It's like literally the connections that neurons send to each other, called axons. And so, interestingly, despite the evidence that they showed, that sticking to the Mediterranean diet was associated with better cognitive health or cognitive performance later on in life, they didn't catch any evidence of any kind of structural differences between the people who did and who did not stick to that Mediterranean diet. And so, MRIs are very useful. Don't get me wrong, but there's not all that much we can infer from an MRI, regarding like how the brain is like really working. So for example, I have some fun examples for you on deck. Boom. Let's see. Does it play automatically? Lovely. So for me, it would have been interesting if they had done something like DTI, diffuse tensor imaging, which can show quite a bit more about the connectivity between different brain regions than an MRI can, right? So here's like a sense of what that looks like. So this is of a 20-year-old female. And you can sort of get a sense of what I'm talking about when it comes to DTI, right? You can see all these little fibers pointing in various directions. And so you can get a sense of like who's talking to whom in the brain, as well as like how much they likely interact, these different brain regions. And so, yay, fun, colorful examples. That's what neuroscience is good at. And I have more colors for you, Isa. You'll be happy to know. So other than DTI, right? So that's DTI. It's a beautiful and very useful technique, but it's not the only technique that we can use. So other than DTI, I could imagine, fMRI being used to get a sense of differences in how various brain regions, here's some fMRI for you, how various brain regions interact, right? So basically taking fMRI, right? And so you can see in this video, you can see areas that have, red splotches, and they're sort of scanning through a brain, right? You can see areas, usually red, orange, hot colors tend to denote increased activity, whereas blue colors, cold colors, does it start automatically again? Let's just refresh. Yeah, here we go. And then so blue colors tends to denote like reduced activity. And so, you could do fMRI to get a sense of like differences in how various parts of the brains of people who do and do not adhere to the Mediterranean diet or any kind of diet tend to interact when you're just sort of like sitting and just chilling at rest, right? Something called functional connectivity, just so you can get a sense, right, like of a better sense of like how different brain regions are interacting with one another, and see if there's any consistent differences that distinguish folks who adhere to the Mediterranean diet from those who don't. And so, these are just ways to get like a better sense of what's going on inside someone's, head, inside someone's brain, compared to just like literally seeing the gross anatomy, like the shapes of our brain, which is what they did with MRI. So I bring all this up to say, like, there very likely are differences that they could have detected had they used something more granular or more revealing than MRI. But still an interesting paper. So, but what can we learn from this paper? So we can't know for sure, right, that it's like specifically the Mediterranean diet that like causes better cognition, as people get older. Like it may just come along as like a package of healthier lives, right? Even though they did attempt to control for that. They did attempt to control for, not smoking, for exercise and things like that. But we can't know for sure. And we also can't know if there's like a specific mechanism that might explain this. But what they suggest, these are the data they have. And what those data suggest is that eating more green leafy vegetables and reducing red meat intake was particularly associated with improved cognition as people get older. So, like surprise, surprise, right? Eating your veggies and not eating too much steak is probably a pretty prudent life choice. But it is more evidence, right, that the Mediterranean diet is probably among the various diets from which you can choose. The Mediterranean diet should be towards the top of your list. It's not the only healthy diet. There's also the MIND diet, the DASH diet. I talked about those types of diets in the past. But the Mediterranean diet it's also pretty delicious too. So anyways, I am on a strict diet of blue cheese and beer. Hey, listen, I don't blame you. You are from Copenhagen, so Denmark. I don't really know. I'm sure Denmark produces wonderful cheese. My favorite cheese that I learned from a friend of mine in France is called Délice de Bourgogne. Délice du Bourgogne. You have to eat it with gloves. Like that's the kind of cheese we're talking about. And my favorite beer is Belgian. So yeah, if I lived in your neck of the woods, I would probably be consuming way too much of that. It's not easy enough for me to acquire both here for me to actually like rely on that being my diet, a diet strictly of cheese and beer. I do have like 5 Trappist ales in my fridge that are now probably about 10 years old. I'll have to bust one of those out pretty soon. Okay, next study. This is a pretty crazy paper. It's very cool. So it was covered in the New York Times. You can check out. Carl Zimmer wrote about it. Excellent science writer. So you can check that out if you are subscribed. But I'll talk about it here too. So you don't have to worry about that if you're not subscribed. So I've talked about organoids in the past. Oh, shoot. Gosh, I am just not on the ball. No big deal. Super fast. Rolling with the punches. And we're ready. So organoids are basically tiny little mini organs, right? You can make an organoid version of pretty much any kind of organ, including the brain. And that's what this team did. So this is to give you a sense of what organoids can look like, sort of like the end of your pinky, right? But what's great about them is that they're far more similar to a brain than just having like a bunch of neurons and glial cells just like sitting in a petri dish, right? They can make connections with each other in 3 dimensions, and they can therefore interact with each other far more effectively in a way that's comparable to how they would interact in the brain. So you're studying something that's a little bit more closely related to an actual human brain. Not an actual human brain, of course, because those are pretty difficult to study. But better than just like poking neurons in a dish, right? Hey, Betty, good to see you. Um, building up a bigger picture. Yeah, exactly. Something that just reflects the environment, that these neurons would typically encounter, right, in an actual brain. So as you know, humans, Homo sapiens, we Homo sapiens, aren't the only primates stomping around Earth at the moment. And we're certainly not the only bipeds that were doing so, particularly several 100,000 years ago. In fact, humans, Homo sapiens, evolutionarily split from the other main primate games in town about 600,000 years ago. So Neanderthals and Denisovans. Okay, and I thought I uploaded everything and I did not. Goofball. Here we go. No big deal. So about 600,000 years ago, we split from some fairly distant relatives, the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. And so as we split, the human brain got more complicated and got actually rounder. But we've been pretty limited to just like looking at these kinds of skulls, right? To get a sense of like how these changes might have occurred biologically, genetically, and more importantly, how those genetic changes ended up influencing our biology. And most importantly to me, most interestingly, I think to everyone, is how those genetic changes would have influenced our brains. So this was a gigantic team here. I will pull, and obviously, these are the skulls of a human, of a Neanderthal, and a Denisovan. Excuse me. So this study was gargantuan. And I usually like to include the names of all the authors, but there's so many. Like, it's a huge paper. It was a gigantic team, and it was from a bunch of different institutions in California, London, Brazil, Seattle, Nebraska, Missouri. I think there's probably other ones. It's just a huge paper with tons of authors. And so they tried to explore this story a little bit, this biology. And so what they did was to reconstruct a Neanderthal genome by combining all that they've learned from the various bones and stuff from Neanderthals that have been recovered over the years, right? So you can think of it as sort of like a fossil genome. And so what they found, to sum up a lot of work that they did, they found 61 genes in particular, right, that may have been key to the divergence of humans from Neanderthals, right? Just 61 genes out of somewhere around 20,000 protein coding genes in our genomes, genes that are that actually code for something that's actually expressed, and then about as many genes that don't necessarily code for anything, but play some genetic role, right? So just 61 out of tens of thousands of genes. And so this is a team that I'll bring the I think this is a more interesting image to check out. Hey Peter, good to see you, man. So this team has experience with organoids, past experience with organoids. And I've actually talked about their work in the past, maybe even last week. They used organoids to understand how the Zika virus, that other most recent epidemic from around 2015 that I'm sure has been completely jettisoned from your memory, certainly over the past year. So this is a team that knows what they're doing when it comes to these little useful little fleshy nubbins, these organoids. And so they looked through the various genes that they'd honed in on, right? And then they decided to focus on one gene, NOVA1. So NOVA1 makes a protein that influences a bunch of other proteins, okay? And it's quite associated with the development of the brain, the early stages of the brain development, rather than ongoing processes that's likely happening in your brain or in my brain. And part of the reason, and so that makes sense, right? These early sort of developmental factors that might distinguish a human from a Neanderthal. And one of the other reasons that they honed in on it is humans seem to have a particularly unique mutation in NOVA1. Okay, and so what they did, which is pretty crazy. Here, I'll bring back the organoids. So yeah, you can get a sense of what it actually looked like, what the stuff that they were working with. So what they did is they introduced a version of NOVA1, that gene, that they had found in the genome they'd reconstructed from all those bones and fossils and so on, from Neanderthals. They introduced that fossil version of NOVA1 into their organoids. And then they checked out how the organoids would be different from human organoids, how they would develop differently. And you can get a sense here. So here is Well, shoot, I see what happened. Okay, I see what's happening. It's not all my fault, everybody. Aren't we happy? Okay, so first, let me show you a human organoid that they made. This is from their paper. Right, so human organoids that they produced were nice and smooth, but when they looked at the Neanderthal organoids, which you can see there on the side, on the right, they developed being like weirdly rough and bumpy, right? And you can sort of see that just from their image. Nice, smooth human organoids, weird, bumpy, rough Neanderthal organoids. And so, you know, there's broad differences, right, that we're talking about there, right? You can literally see that with a microscope. You don't have to do any actual like molecular biology or anything. But evidently, they also detected that the types of brain cells that ended up composing the two organoids were different. So different types of neurons composed the Neanderthal organoid compared to the human. You know, different ratios of, let's say, glutamatergic neurons, neurons that release glutamate, or dopamine-releasing neurons, or serotonin-releasing neurons, different ratios that distinguished human from Neanderthal organoids. And the Neanderthal organoids seem to exhibit action potentials, you know, neurons firing impulses, several weeks earlier than the human organoids. However, and this is probably key, the firing patterns were evidently disorganized for a longer period of time. They didn't get coordinated into sort of like coherent waves of activity that occurs in your brain and mine until after the human organoid did. So it became active earlier. The Neanderthal organoid became active earlier, but it was incoherent for longer. Pretty interesting. So, and that was just one gene. So what probably happened is that either they had already done a lot of studies previously. I mean, there are good reasons to hone in on Nova1, clearly, but you know, there was 60 other genes that they had in their, you know, hat full of possible options, right? And so, you know, it might have just been that they were incredibly lucky, or a little bit of like behind the scenes. What I think probably happened is that they did test all of those other genes. They tested, you know, probably several dozen before they landed on this interesting result from Nova1. And they just said, hey, we were lucky. First one, nailed it. And the reason for that, so that, and again, I don't know this for sure, but very luckily in my mind. The reason for that is because they need to write grants, right? And so saying that you've already found the one, or you've already studied all these other genes and they ended up not delivering any, you know, substantial differences, that means you can't write a grant to say you're going to study those genes that you've already studied. That's what I think probably happened. Nothing wrong with that. That is like, you know, standard. It's like, you know, business decisions essentially. And this is a very remarkable discovery, so they deserve grants. And the reason I suspect that is because the team explicitly said they're going to start doing similar types of studies with organoids with the rest of those 60 other genes, probably even more, that they identified that seem to be like rather unique to the human genome. So we can more precisely start to trace the story of how humans came to be, right? We have a sense of the broad strokes of the story of human evolution. You know, the titles of the chapters, right? The intro paragraphs, things like that, the main characters. We sort of already know that kind of stuff for the most part, but this kind of research is you know, filling in the details of the story, right? The ambiance, the setting, the, you know, characterization, you know, these types of things. And I just think it's super duper cool. And I can't wait to see, you know, more studies from this group. This group, yeah, like I said, focused on Zika virus in the past. And I believe they collaborated with the group who did a study that I talked about in the past about COVID-19 or SARS coronavirus 2 being able to infect neurons in organoids and actually penetrate into the organoids. So it's a cool team. I'm glad they exist, and I can't wait to see more from them. All right, here, let's see if I can start Periscope one more time. That's too bad that it's not working. Oh, well. So that's pretty much what I have for you. There's a bunch of other interesting studies, but I don't have any like interesting like graphics from them. So I guess I'll call it an episode. More like an episode this time, not much live chat. Hey, from Tallahassee. I don't know if I knew you were from Tallahassee, Betty. Very nice. All right, everybody. Well, thanks for joining. And if you are catching this on some sort of replay, I'd appreciate it if you'd share it. Share the platform, share this video. And if you have any input on how you think I could do this better, please let me know. I'd love to see you do an episode, an epilepsy episode. I'd be happy to. There's a bunch of really interesting things. Epilepsy is obviously like a really, really well-established domain of neuroscience research. Epilepsy has been studied for a long, long time, like before neuroscience really, probably technically existed formally. And there's all these papers way back in the day about epilepsy. Of course, it is one of those conditions that used to be consigned to, people being possessed, more spiritual explanations. Fortunately, we have better explanations for it now. One of the most interesting things about epilepsy for me is that there are a lot of psychiatric conditions. When most of us think of epilepsy and seizures, we think of convulsant status epilepticus, convulsant epilepsy, where people's muscles are uncontrollably convulsing, right? Or, contracting, usually rhythmically, or it can be the loss of the ability to contract muscles. That's, I think, what usually comes to mind. But there's a whole huge category of non-convulsant status epilepticus, non-convulsant epilepsy. And, that can range from like having an absence seizure where people just sort of like zone out. They're not really responsive to their environment. And then they just pop back in. And it's sort of like, it's like if somebody was editing a video and they just like cut, chop, put together, and that time is just gone, right, because of that seizure. But there's a whole category of seizures that occur in parts of the brain where there's no overt manifestation of the seizure. There's no, muscular contractions. There's no loss of muscle tone. There's not even necessarily any kind of like obvious changes to your sensorium, like changes to your sensory experiences, like seeing colors or auras, right? None of that. And it turns out that a pretty substantial proportion of people who have, non-convulsant seizures also tend to have psychiatric conditions like depression, anxiety conditions. And so it does beg the question, are these psychiatric conditions attributable to those seizures? Or, or really it forces one to wonder what the relationships are between that uncontrolled seizure-like activity in those regions of the brain that potentially regulate those mood-associated processes that are associated with things like, depression, anxiety. And so if instead of trying to treat the anxiety or the depression, for which we have fairly, mediocre treatments, not particularly effective, room for improvement, they're effective for some people, but not nearly enough people, could actually targeting a seizure-like activity in the brains of these folks, could that yield superior treatments? It's an interesting question, and for which we don't actually have an answer. But yeah, I'd be happy to talk more in depth. Can the child of someone who has epilepsy develop psychological conditions like depression? Well, exactly. Well, certainly, of course they can. Anybody can, right? But I know the question you're asking is, I suspect, forgive me if I'm inferring incorrectly, is there a relationship between a parent who has epilepsy and a genetic transmission of some kind of psychiatric condition? So, I'm unaware of any kind of like formal stats that actually like bear that out, that actually like demonstrate like, yes, if you have one or two parents who have epilepsy, you have an, X% increased risk of developing depression or generalized anxiety disorder or whatever. However, I don't think it's a significant leap to suspect that there might be some kind of relationship there. So yes, and just as I was discussing, like that whole category of patients, and what's difficult about this category of patients who have non-convulsant seizures and psychiatric conditions, what's frustrating is that, of course, they don't know that they're having seizures. And so they go to a hospital or to a clinic for their psychiatric condition. Maybe they're experiencing suicidal ideation. Maybe they're just depressed and they want treatment. It's very rare that you would have, so they'd go see a psychiatrist or psychologist, therapist or something. And it's just exceedingly rare that the first thing that would come to the mind of those physicians is, let's strap an EEG on. let's measure their brain activity to see if they're having seizures, right? It's like not even close to top of mind when it comes to somebody presenting with psychiatric conditions. And so as a result, they end up going through all these various treatments that, may not have any capability to actually address the underlying neurological cause of their psychiatric conditions. So yeah, I mean, all of this to say, it's theoretically possible that the child of somebody with seizures or somebody with epilepsy who has a certain form of epilepsy inherits an increased probability or propensity to have seizures in perhaps a different part of the brain, right? Seizures, epilepsy comes about by a variety of different mechanisms. You can have slight genetic differences in ion channels. These are the channels on neurons that really are like literally the nuts and bolts of how neurons can fire impulses, right? These channels allow ions to flow, allow current to flow. And so, studies have shown that like slight, unique genetic components, forms, let's say, of those ion channels can be associated with epilepsy. But then there's also, receptors, neurotransmitter receptors that can be associated. There's just like a whole variety of ways by which epilepsy can come about. And, it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that they would manifest in the same way, because of course a child has a lot of your genes. Like my daughter has about half of my genes, but her mother's genes as well. And so, you're going to have a distinct, neurological landscape in the brain of the child of somebody with epilepsy. I don't have epilepsy, but other psychological conditions, psychiatric conditions. Oh, and then can the child of someone who has epilepsy? Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, yeah. Anyways, thanks, man. Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it. And I'm happy to, I've talked about epilepsy a few times in the recent past, but yeah, I'm happy to I'm sure there's some really interesting study that just came out. Epilepsy is always being studied because again, just like with psychiatric conditions, we have some pretty effective treatments for epilepsy, but they're rife with side effects that are incredibly unpleasant. They can be very sedating. They can sort of induce a kind of cognitive fogginess. And so, yeah, there's a race to, and then, of course, some of the treatments are literally surgical, right? Which is highly invasive, literally lesioning very select parts of the brain to, mitigate, the frequency of the seizures. But of course, that's not an operation anybody typically wants to have. In fact, I just talked to somebody last Sunday that is going to have, brain surgery because she has severe epilepsy. Anyways, all right. Yeah, so in the future, we can dive in a little bit more deeply. Otherwise, thanks for hanging out, everybody, and I will see you in the near future. Have a great weekend.